Looking back, I can see the signs now, the small things that didn't add up. At the time, though, I brushed them off like any husband would. Claire had always been driven, ambitious to a fault sometimes, but I admired that about her. When we first got married, it felt like we were building something together, laying the foundation for a life we'd always dreamed of. That's what I thought, anyway. It all started with her uncle. Frank was the black sheep of her family, the kind of man who had more money than sense and a string of failed marriages to prove it. He lived alone in this massive, over-the-top estate on the outskirts of town, surrounded by antique cars and a collection of strange art he claimed was worth millions. Claire had a complicated relationship with him. She'd call him eccentric, sometimes with a fondness in her voice, other times with barely concealed disdain. He wasn't a likable man, but he was generous in his own way, and Claire insisted on keeping the connection alive. When Frank's health started to decline, Claire was the first to step up. She visited him regularly, bringing groceries, arranging for his appointments, and even spending nights at his house to keep him company. She said he had no one else, and maybe she was right. It was hard to argue with her sense of duty, though part of me wondered if she was more motivated by his wealth than his well-being. At first, I didn't mind. If anything, I was impressed by her commitment. But then she started spending more and more time at his place. Her explanations were vague. Frank needed her help organizing his finances, or he wanted someone to go through his old belongings with him. It sounded plausible enough, but I couldn't help noticing how secretive she became. She wouldn't let me come along, saying Frank valued his privacy, and whenever I asked about their time together, her answers were brief and distracted. One night, after she came home from another long evening at Frank's, I asked her point blank, "What's going on with you two?" She froze for a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she gave me this look, part exasperation, part pity. "He's dying, Mark. He's lonely and scared, and I'm the only family he trusts. Why are you making this about you?" It was a good deflection, and I felt like an ass for even asking. But something about her tone didn't sit right with me. Things took a stranger turn a few weeks later. I was in our home office, looking for some paperwork, when I came across a folder tucked behind the desk. It wasn't mine, and when I opened it, I found a stack of legal documents, trust agreements, property appraisals, even a draft of a will. Frank's will. The first thing I noticed was that Claire was listed as the sole beneficiary. Not a mention of his kids from his earlier marriages, or even distant relatives. Just Claire. When I confronted her about it, she didn't deny it. "Frank wanted it that way," she said simply. "He doesn't trust anyone else." "Don't you think that's a little odd?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She shrugged. "He's eccentric, Mark. We've talked about this. He doesn't have anyone else he trusts. Why are you acting like this is some big conspiracy?" That was her way of shutting me down, making me feel like I was overreacting. So I dropped it, but the unease didn't go away. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place the night Frank died. I was at home when Claire called, her voice shaky but composed. "He's gone," she said. "I'll be home soon." When she got back, she barely spoke about what had happened, brushing off my questions with vague answers. She went straight to bed, claiming she was exhausted. But later that night, I heard her on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out much of what she was saying, but one phrase stuck with me. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." The next morning, Claire acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, scrolled through her phone at the kitchen table, and talked casually about our son's upcoming school project. It was as if the phone call I overheard the night before hadn't happened. I wanted to bring it up, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she avoided looking me directly in the eye, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that if I pushed too hard, she'd find a way to make me feel like the bad guy again. Instead, I decided to keep my distance and watch. Claire threw herself into handling Frank's estate with the same determination she'd shown while taking care of him in his final months. There were lawyers, appraisers, and a seemingly endless parade of paperwork. She was gone more than she was home, and when I asked how things were going, her answers were always vague. "It's a lot to manage," she'd say, "but I'm handling it." One evening, as she was heading out the door with a stack of files in her arms, I stopped her. "Do you need help with any of this?" I asked, trying to sound supportive. "No," she said quickly, almost too quickly. It's better if I just handle it. Frank trusted me, and I don't want to complicate things. Her words didn't sit right with me, but I let her go. The truth was, I didn't know how to press the issue without tipping her off that I was suspicious. It wasn't until a week later that I finally decided to dig deeper. Claire was out, and I found myself in our home office again, sifting through her neatly organized files. Most of it was standard estate paperwork, transfer of assets, tax documents, and legal forms. But tucked near the back of the drawer was a folder I hadn't seen before. Inside was a single piece of paper, a bank statement for an account I didn't recognize. The balance was staggering, nearly 7 figures. My stomach turned as I scanned the document. The account was in Claire's name, and the deposits matched the timeline of her visits to Frank's house. When Claire came home that night, I was waiting for her in the living room. I held up the bank statement, my expression unreadable. "What's this?" Her face didn't change, but I noticed the way her hand tightened on her bag. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "In the office," I replied. "In your files. Care to explain why you have an account with this much money in it?" She sighed, setting her bag down and sitting across from me. "Frank set that up for me," she said. "It's part of the estate. He wanted me to have access to the funds so I could manage things without any delays. It's all legitimate." "Is it?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because it looks a lot like you've been siphoning money into a private account." Her eyes narrowed. "You're seriously accusing me of stealing? From my own uncle?" "I'm asking for an explanation, Claire," I said, "because none of this adds up. The money, the secrecy, the late-night calls. What's really going on?" She stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something crack in her carefully composed demeanor. "You wouldn't understand," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Try me," I said. Claire leaned back, rubbing her temples. "Fine," she said. "Frank wasn't the man you thought he was. He had enemies, people who wanted to take everything from him. He trusted me to protect his legacy, and that's what I'm doing. That's what the money is for. To make sure the right people get what they deserve." Her words didn't make any sense, and the way she delivered them only made me more suspicious. "What enemies?" I asked. "And what do you mean by the right people?" She shook her head. "I can't explain it all right now. Just trust me, okay? I'm doing this for us, for our family." "Trust you?" I said, my voice rising. "How am I supposed to trust you when you've been lying to me for months?" Claire stood abruptly, grabbing her bag. "I don't have time for this," she said. "Believe what you want, but I know what I'm doing." And with that, she walked out, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. Claire came home late again the next night, her hair slightly disheveled and a faint scent of expensive cologne clinging to her coat. She didn't usually wear perfume herself, but tonight she carried the unmistakable trace of something unfamiliar. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral as she set her bag on the counter. "Exhausting," she replied with a small sigh, avoiding my gaze as she poured herself a glass of wine. "The lawyer has been running me ragged with paperwork. Settling an estate this large is a nightmare." I leaned against the counter, watching her closely. "What's his name again?" "The lawyer." "Matthew Grant," she said casually, swirling her wine glass. "Why?" "No reason," I said, filing the name away. "You talk about him a lot, that's all." Claire shot me a sharp look, but her expression quickly softened into one of practiced indifference. "He's been handling everything for Frank's estate. Of course, I talk about him. Do you have a problem with that?" "No," I said, holding up my hands. "Just curious." She didn't respond, downing the rest of her wine before heading upstairs. The next morning, while Claire was out, I decided to find out more about Matthew Grant. A quick online search revealed a polished headshot of a man in his early 40s, sharply dressed with the kind of practiced smile you'd expect from someone who spent his life in courtrooms and conference rooms. His bio was impressive: partner at a prestigious law firm, a history of handling high-profile estate cases, and several glowing client reviews. But it wasn't his professional reputation that caught my attention. It was a comment buried in an article about Frank's estate, where Grant was quoted as saying, "I've worked closely with Claire for months, and her dedication to her uncle's legacy is truly inspiring. The words were innocuous enough, but there was something about them that felt off. I spent the rest of the day digging deeper, scrolling through social media and old news archives. Most of it was unremarkable, but a post on Claire's Instagram from a few months ago stopped me cold. It was a photo of her sitting at an outdoor cafe, smiling over a cup of coffee. The caption read, "Productive meeting with the best lawyer in town?" And there he was, Matthew Grant, seated across from her, his body angled toward her in a way that felt too familiar. When Claire came home that evening, I decided to push her a little. "So," I said as we sat down for dinner, "how's Matthew?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Matthew?" "The lawyer," I said. "You've been spending so much time with him lately. I figured you'd have stories." Claire set her fork down, her expression tightening. "Mark, if you're trying to accuse me of something, just say it." "I'm not accusing you of anything," I said. "I'm just curious about the guy you're apparently spending all your time with." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't take the bait. "Matthew is a professional. That's all you need to know." "That's funny," I said, leaning back in my chair, "because I was looking him up today. Seems like a pretty charming guy. You even called him the best lawyer in town on Instagram." Her face paled slightly, and she stood abruptly, taking her plate to the sink. "This is ridiculous," she said, her back to me. "I'm not going to sit here and justify my actions to you. You've always been jealous, Mark, and honestly, it's exhausting." I didn't respond, watching as she stormed out of the kitchen. The next day, I took a half day from work and drove to Matthew Grant's office. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, but when I asked to speak with him, her expression shifted. "Mr. Grant is in a meeting," she said. "That's fine," I replied, glancing at the hallway behind her desk. "I'll wait." As I sat there, a door down the hall opened, and I caught a glimpse of Claire walking out, her hand resting briefly on Matthew's arm as they spoke in low voices. She looked relaxed, almost intimate, in a way that sent a pang of anger through me. They didn't notice me as she slipped out through a side door, leaving Matthew to walk back to his office. I stood and followed him, ignoring the receptionist's protests. "Matthew Grant," I said, stepping into his office. He looked up from his desk, startled. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, closing the door behind me. "I'm Mark, Claire's husband." Understanding flickered across his face, followed by a carefully controlled expression. "What can I do for you, Mr. Williams?" I took a step closer, my eyes locked on his. "I don't know, Matthew. Maybe you can tell me why my wife is spending so much time with you. Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look like just business." He held my gaze for a moment before leaning back in his chair, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "I understand your concerns," he said smoothly, "but I assure you, my relationship with Claire is strictly professional." "Professional?" I said, my voice laced with disbelief. "That's interesting, because I just watched her walk out of here looking like she owns the place." Matthew's expression didn't falter. "Your wife has been under a lot of stress, Mr. Williams. Managing an estate of this size is no small task. I've been doing my best to support her through the process." "Support her?" I snapped. "Is that what you call it?" His calm demeanor finally cracked, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "If you have any concerns about my conduct, feel free to take it up with the State Bar Association. Otherwise, I suggest you focus on supporting your wife instead of making baseless accusations." I wanted to argue, to call him out for the smug way he dismissed me, but I couldn't. He'd given me nothing concrete, just enough plausible deniability to keep me spinning my wheels. As I left his office, one thing became clear. Matthew Grant was hiding something, and whatever it was, Claire was right in the middle of it. The day it all came crashing down started like any other. Claire left in the morning, claiming she needed to meet Matthew to finalize some estate documents. It wasn't unusual by now, but something about the way she avoided my eyes before walking out the door felt off. I decided to follow her. It wasn't hard to track her. Her predictable routine and my growing unease had turned me into someone I barely recognized. A man willing to shadow his own wife just to uncover the truth. She drove downtown, parked in the lot next to Matthew Grant's office, and walked in without hesitation. I waited, watching the building from my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as minutes turned to hours. When the sun began to dip below the horizon and the office lights dimmed, I saw them leave. Claire was laughing at something Matthew said, her hand brushing against his arm as they walked toward a nearby hotel. My stomach tightened. The pieces I'd been trying to avoid putting together suddenly fit with brutal clarity. They weren't just conspiring over legal documents. They were lovers. I followed them inside, keeping my distance as they checked in and disappeared into an elevator. The realization that my suspicions had been right didn't bring relief. It brought anger, an all-consuming rage that made it hard to think straight. When I reached the elevator, I waited until the doors opened on their floor and stepped out, keeping my steps light as I trailed behind them. They entered a room at the end of the hall, the door clicking shut behind them. I stood there for a moment, torn between walking away and confronting them. The choices was made for me when I heard Claire's voice, muffled but clear through the thin hotel walls. "You always know how to get me worked up," she said, her tone teasing and full of warmth I hadn't heard in months. "Then let me show you just how much I've missed you," Matthew replied, his voice low and eager. I felt sick, but I couldn't leave. I pressed my ear against the door, hating myself for listening but unable to stop. Inside, their voices grew more heated, interspersed with gasps and laughter. I couldn't make out every word, but the intimacy between them was unmistakable. Then came the sounds of their bodies moving, their breaths quickening, and Claire's soft moans of pleasure. It was a level of passion I hadn't seen from her in years, and knowing it was directed at him felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my fist against the door, rattling it in its frame. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard Claire's panicked voice. "Mark." Before they could react, I shoved the door open and stepped inside. Claire was scrambling to pull the bedsheet around her, her hair a mess and her face flushed. Matthew was still sitting on the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, looking shocked but not ashamed. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "Mark, Claire started, but I cut her off. "Don't," I snapped, my gaze shifting to Matthew. "You. Get the hell out of here before I kill you." Matthew smirked, standing slowly and adjusting his shirt. "I don't think you're in any position to make threats, Mark," he said, his tone smug. That was it. I lunged at him, landing a solid punch to his jaw that sent him stumbling back against the wall. He swung back, but I dodged, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the dresser. "You think you can walk into my life and take what's mine?" I growled, my fist poised to strike again. "Stop it, Mark." Claire screamed, grabbing my arm. "Please stop." I shoved Matthew away, breathing heavily as he slumped against the dresser, glaring at me with blood trickling from his lip. "You're pathetic," he muttered. Ignoring him, I turned to Claire. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice trembling. "And this is how you repay me?" "With him." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't say anything. I didn't wait for an explanation. I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Back in the car, I sat in silence for a long time, my thoughts racing. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, determination. They thought they could humiliate me, use me, and walk away unscathed. But they were wrong. I drove to my friend Jake's house, the only person I trusted to talk about this. He listened patiently as I told him everything, his expression hardening as the story unfolded. "You need to leave her," Jake said bluntly when I finished. "I know," I replied. "And you need to make sure they don't get away with this," he added. "Frank's estate, the money. Don't let them walk off with it like nothing happened." "How?" I asked. Jake leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "You dig. You find out everything you can about their little scheme and blow it up. Leave them with nothing." For the first time all night, I felt a flicker of hope. Jake was right. Claire and Matthew had underestimated me, but they wouldn't get away with it. Not if I had anything to say about it. The next morning, I woke up on Jake's couch, my mind already racing with possibilities. The anger I'd felt the night before hadn't faded, but now it was focused. I wasn't going to let Claire and Matthew walk away with Frank's fortune, or with any piece of my life. Jake sat across from me, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. "I've been thinking," he said without looking up. "You need leverage. Something that proves they're scheming together. If you can expose what they're doing, they won't just lose the money, they might even face legal trouble." He was right. The only way to beat them was to dig into their plans and uncover the full extent of their betrayal. "How do I even start?" I asked, running a hand through my hair. Jake smirked. "Lucky for you. I have connections. There's a guy I know, a private investigator. He's discreet, thorough, and doesn't ask too many questions. If there's something to find, he'll find it." Within an hour, we were sitting in a small office that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. The investigator, a wiry man named Vic, leaned back in his chair as I explained the situation. He nodded occasionally, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "So, you're saying your wife and this lawyer are working together to siphon money out of Frank's estate?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes," I said firmly. "I don't have all the details, but I know they're hiding something. I want proof, documents, recordings, whatever you can find." Vic scratched his chin thoughtfully. "It'll cost you," he said, "but if they're up to something shady, I'll get you what you need." "Money isn't an issue," Jake said, handing over an envelope filled with cash. "Just get it done." Vic nodded, tucking the envelope into his jacket. "Give me a few days," he said. The next few days were a blur of tension and impatience. I avoided Claire completely, ignoring her calls and messages. She left voicemails asking where I was, saying we needed to talk, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to her lies. Instead, I focused on the kids, doing everything I could to shield them from the storm brewing around us. When Vic called me with an update, I felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. "You're going to want to see this in person," he said. I met him at his office, where he handed me a folder filled with documents and photos. "They've been transferring money from the estate into offshore accounts," he explained. "The accounts are in both their names, your wife and the lawyer. And that's not all. I got audio of them discussing how to cover their tracks." I opened the folder, my stomach turning as I flipped through the evidence. Bank statements, wire transfers, even a transcript of a conversation where Matthew suggested forging a document to speed up the process. It was damning. "This is enough to bury them," Vic said. I didn't doubt him. With this evidence, Claire and Matthew wouldn't just lose the money. They could face serious legal consequences. But even as I stared at the proof of their betrayal, I felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't just about money. This was the woman I'd loved, the life we'd built together, now reduced to a pile of lies and stolen funds. "What's the plan?" Jake asked when I showed him the folder later that evening. "I'm taking this to Frank's other relatives," I said. "They deserve to know what's going on. If we can prove Claire and Matthew manipulated the will, they might be able to contest it." Jake nodded. "And the police?" "I'll handle that once the family's involved," I said. "I want them to see this first." Reaching out to Frank's estranged relatives wasn't easy. Most of them hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I explained what I'd uncovered, they were quick to listen. We met at a neutral location, a small conference room in a local hotel, where I laid out the evidence for them. "This is disgusting," one of them, a middle-aged woman named Diana, said as she flipped through the documents. "I always knew Claire was ambitious, but this is beyond anything I imagined." The family agreed to take legal action, hiring their own lawyer to contest the will and launch an investigation into Claire and Matthew's activities. I handed over Vic's folder, feeling a sense of satisfaction as they promised to bring everything to light. When I left the meeting, I called Claire for the first time in days. She answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant. "Mark, we need to talk," I said. "Where are you?" she asked. "Meet me at the house," I said. "Now." I hung up before she could respond, heading home to prepare for the confrontation. It was time to let her know that her game was over. I was sitting at the dining table when Claire walked in, her expression a mix of confusion and nervousness. She hadn't seen me in days, and the tension between us was thick. She set her bag down by the door and folded her arms. "You said we needed to talk," she said, her voice cautious. I gestured to the folder sitting on the table. "Take a look." She hesitated, her eyes flickering between me and the folder, before finally picking it up. As she flipped through the pages, her face paled. "What is this?" she asked, though her tone told me she already knew. "It's everything," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The bank accounts, the wire transfers, the conversations you had with Matthew. I know exactly what you've been doing." Claire's hands trembled as she closed the folder and set it back on the table. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice shaky. "Don't," I snapped. "Don't insult me by pretending there's some noble explanation for this. You lied to me, Claire. You schemed with that lawyer to steal Frank's money and keep it all for yourselves." She sank into the chair across from me, her composure crumbling. "Mark, I can explain." "I don't want your explanations," I interrupted. "I want the truth. Why? Why would you do this? Was it all just about the money?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. "It wasn't just about the money," she said quietly. "It was. Matthew convinced me it was the only way. Frank's will was a mess, and he said we'd never get through probate without cutting corners. I didn't want to, but he made it sound so easy." "And the affair?" I asked coldly. "Was that part of the plan too?" Her silence was answer enough. I leaned back in my chair, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You've destroyed everything, Claire. Our marriage, our family. Do you even understand what you've done?" "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered, her tears falling freely now. "I made a mistake, Mark. Please, we can fix this. I'll make it right." I stood, shaking my head. "You can't fix this, Claire. Not this time." Her sobs followed me as I walked to the door, grabbing the overnight bag I'd packed earlier. "What are you doing?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "The kids are staying with me. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and I'll be filing for divorce. As for the money, Frank's family knows everything. They're contesting the will, and they're taking you and Matthew to court. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison." Claire stood, reaching for me, but I stepped back. "Mark, please, don't do this." "You did this," I said, my voice steady. "Not me." I walked out the door without looking back. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional fallout. Frank's family moved quickly, filing lawsuits and freezing the contested assets. Matthew's law firm dropped him as a partner, and the scandal made headlines, tarnishing his reputation. Claire tried to reach out to me, but I blocked her number and refused to engage. My focus was on the kids and rebuilding a life without her. One evening, as I was tucking my son into bed, he looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Is Mommy coming home soon?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. "No, buddy," I said gently. "Mommy's not coming home. But you know what? We're going to be okay. I promise." He nodded, snuggling into his blanket, and I sat with him until he drifted off to sleep. As I sat in the quiet of the living room later that night, I realized that the anger and bitterness I'd carried for so long were beginning to fade. Claire and Matthew had lost everything, and while it didn't erase what they'd done, it was enough for me to let go. The life I'd thought I had was gone, but in its place was something simpler, something real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.